Knives Sports Adventures here. Today I am talking about a knife that is kind of a classic, which is the cold steel Ti-Lite. There are people who love this knife, there are people who hate this knife. I sort of love and hate this knife. We're going to talk about versions of this knife, we're going to talk about problems of this knife, we're going to talk about good things about this knife, and then we'll talk about some conclusions, overall thoughts. So versions of this knife, there are versions with a Zytel handle, there are versions with an aluminum handle, there are versions with a AUS 8 blade, there are versions with a S35 VN blade, there are coated versions, there are uncoated versions, there are versions with a funky crisp blade that's all squiggly. Version for everybody, right? This is the most expensive version, so this is the S35 VN and G10 version. I had some of the cheaper versions of this knife in the past. There were things I didn't like about them enough to where I sold them. So I got the most expensive version to see what it was like and if it was worth going for the upcharge. So all versions of this knife have some problems with it. The cheaper versions that have double steel liners actually have fewer problems than the more expensive version. So the biggest problem with the more expensive version is that it comes with, because it has G10 on one side, it comes with Teflon washers up here in the pivot. I have replaced them on this knife because they were horrible. The Teflon washers that cold steel puts in here, combined with the thickness of the blade, is actually thicker than the space between the sides of the handle, which means that the blade is very tough to open, and no matter how loose you get it, it still stays tough because that material is just too wide. So I replaced these with bronze washers. I recommend you do the same. You shouldn't have to do that on a $150 knife, but there it is. The less expensive versions that I've had with like the aluminum handle and the steel liners actually came with bronze washers when I bought it. So those were actually smoother to open. The second problem that some of these knives have is that the lock is really, really stiff. Some of them you have to actually disassemble, unbend the lock a little bit so that you can get it open. This one I have done that with because it was extremely stiff. The third problem that all of these knives have is that the thumb stud is so short you can barely get your thumb on it. You can see on this one I have added 4 little washers underneath the thumb stud. Thankfully the bolt is long enough to do that, to give me some ability to catch that with my thumb more easily. It improves the knife a lot. I recommend that mod if you can. It costs a few cents. But again, you know, on a $40 knife, I kind of expect that. On a $150 knife, I expect better ergonomics than that. The other problem that every version of this knife that I've ever bought has also had is that these flippers here and here on both sides are extremely sharp. I'm talking like leave wounds or tear your pants sharp. I've had to file them down, sand them down on every version, on every one of these I've ever owned. Again, something that I'm willing to put up with if I really like a cheaper knife, not something you should have to put up with on a knife that's this expensive. So, you know, value for these knives is actually kind of on the cheaper ones. This one, you know, is too expensive really for what it is. So why do I have this knife, right? Why do I keep buying these knives? What's so good about them that it keeps me coming back, even though I know there's some issues with these knives? Well, the thing about this knife that I absolutely love is that it's so comfortable in my hand. Gripping this knife, squeezing it hard, pushing on it when I'm really cutting on something is extremely comfortable, partly because this is just a good, you know, it's a good handle shape. It's on the round side, but the profile is a bit thinner, you know, top to bottom than it is side to side. So it does have some resistance to turning in your hand. The narrowness of the blade helps that because there's not a lot of leverage this way to twist it in your hand. But what really makes this for me is the entire solid back spacer here. A lot of knives are moving to, this is the Griptilian, but pretty much every modern knife now, they're moving to this open concept where it looks cool and you can see the workings of the knife and stuff, but it's not the most comfortable in your hand, especially if there's a big gap in the back. The skin in your hand gets wedged back down in there. It creates more pressure because there's less surface area to push on with your hand. This knife doesn't do any of that. It fills all of that in with a well-supported back spacer, lots of bolts, and it's just so comfortable in your hand. This is as comfortable as a fixed blade, and very few folding knives have that going for them. So that's why I really, really like this knife. Also, just the multiple options of opening. You got the thumb flipper, you've got the thumb stud. If you really loosen it up enough and kind of finagle that lock a little bit, you can flip it a little bit from the back there. You can wave open it out of your pocket. You can put it on something and just kind of push it open that way. So that's really kind of cool. The pocket clip sits nice and flat. When you're gripping it on your hand, you can hardly tell it's there, unlike some other knives. So that's what I really like about this knife. Weight on this knife is nice and light. Let's hit the scale here. We're looking at 3.8 ounces. Size comparison, if you're looking at a Benchmade Griptilian, so it's longer and thinner. Here's a 0 tolerance 0452 carbon fiber, which is a bit longer. Benchmade Griptilian obviously is shorter but wider. Benchmade SOCP folder, right, is actually bigger than this knife. Longer handle, longer blade, narrower handle, so it's not as comfortable. And this is the 6-inch Ti-Lite, which is absolutely enormous. So you can see the SOCP folder is kind of in between those two. And the 0 tolerance 452 carbon fiber kind of falls along that spectrum as well. So there's your size comparison. Let me get into some disassembly. As I'm talking about it here, I am going to disassemble it since this is a full review video. Sharpness on this knife, edge holding, I went with the higher price version because I was not satisfied with the AUS 8A versions. I had some of those in the past and they just don't hold an edge very well. This one, the S35 VN version, is better, but it still doesn't hold a great edge. This is still only did 125 cuts in my sharpness test, and that's on the low side for S35 VN. So they left the heat treat on this a little on the soft side. It's okay, but obviously there's better stuff out there for a lot less money. The bolts, there's 4 bolts on the back spacer to keep it stable and keep it in the back there when your hand's pushing on it. Be careful when you're taking out these pegs because these are different lengths. Each one of these is a different length, so they'll only go back in one space. And if you don't keep track of it, you won't be able to get the knife back together. Because the bolts are, the bottom bolt is also longer than the other ones. So you got to keep track of those bolts, keep track of the pegs as well. Alright, so I'm taking this off of here. I'm going to flip the blade out this way. You'll notice the bronze washers, right? I took those on there. That is not what it comes with. On the G10 version, the G10 liner is only G10 on one side and there's just a metal liner on one side. That is not the same as the other versions. The other versions have steel liners on both sides. So I'm going to set these out in order like I pulled them out so that I don't forget. There's the back spacer. And there's that one. Washers come out. Pivot comes out. This pivot is keyed so it won't spin on you. the pegs on the back are also keyed, so that you can put them in without having difficulty. From the other side, they won't spin on you. So that's a nice feature. I like that. So as far as conclusions on this knife, to me, given the problems that there are with it, the version of this knife that actually makes the most sense to me is the base model. The fit and finish on this knife is what I would expect of a knife in the $40 range, maybe. When you get up to this knife in $150, and you're at $150 for this version, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because there are so much better knives out there for the same amount of money that hold an edge better and are much more refined. As far as like a liner lock knife goes, this is probably one of the sturdier ones, just because they put some stamping in here. It's a steel liner lock. It's well spring tempered and everything. So there are some benefits to this one. There are some drawbacks. I would personally recommend the cheaper versions. So that is what I think of this knife. I hope that is helpful for everyone. Enjoy the video, like, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff, and keep adventuring.